And in this understanding of the social construction of whiteness, and how it then directly connects to how we make sense of racial tensions historically in the US, we can come to better understand conversations around prejudice and discrimination. We know that, and oftentimes, again, these terms are used interchangeably and they do not mean the same thing. So it's important, again, for me to make sure that you have a good kind of understanding of what they mean. When I'm talking about prejudice, or when you see the term prejudice, that is a learned prejudgment about members of a particular social group that we do not belong to. So prejudice is based on not having enough knowledge, not having experience with a particular group, and they're oftentimes very simplistic judgments and assumptions that you make and project on a particular group. As I'm sharing this, whether or not we want to be honest and embrace it or not, we have all been prejudiced at some point, right? We have all had limited knowledge or experience with some particular group and made very simplistic judgments about who we think they are. Okay? Discrimination is the action based on the prejudice towards people that are different from ourselves. So when we act on our prejudgments, then we are discriminating. Okay? That's the difference between the two. I want to reinforce in this moment that all humans have prejudice and discriminate. Okay? If we can move past some of the ways in which we try to put a wall up when we get to this point of, oh no, I've never thought negatively, or I've never thought or discriminated, if we get past that, then we might be able to truly think about the ways that we really could dismantle and disrupt the ways in which this shows up very blatantly in the lives of certain groups across the country and the world, really, right? Prejudice informs oftentimes how we view others. And it necessarily, and oftentimes it informs how we interact with those others, right? So I underline this portion of the presentation because oftentimes the conversations become limited and stifled, and they stop because of this fear to be seen as someone who has had a prejudgment or has discriminated about or on someone in the past. But if we all embrace this idea that at some point we have done this, then we can move towards finding ways to proactively not do it again, right? So think about that. Think about that in your own experiences. And think about then in that acknowledgement, might we be able to move into more depth and understanding in the context of thinking about race and ethnicity and the tensions that exist within our society and in our school spaces. I want to bring us to a note of understanding the isms and what that means. So it could be applied in this particular context, racism, right? But it could also apply to other aspects, sexism, ageism that we experience societally as we are in different spaces, ableism. But it's important as we're tending to the isms that we know that there are components of intergroup relations that are at play. These are interethnic or intergroup relations that are often at play that people suggest are the dominant or at the forefront of the tensions that we see. And that is not the case, okay? It's not something that's new. And oftentimes it's used as a shield to really hide what really might be happening as we're tending to those isms. We know that discriminatory practices have oftentimes utilized this, the interethnic and interracial conflict as a mask for the ways in which dominant ideologies are protected as the superior status, right? It's almost like a look over there kind of dynamic, right? To distract from what is really at play and happening. And we also know that oftentimes, as we're attending to isms, there's some components of economic resources that reinforce and sustain the superior status of the dominant group that makes it challenging oftentimes to disrupt or to dismantle, okay? When we're thinking about discrimination in the isms, we need to note that they are not the same thing, right? As I suggested on the previous slide, all people have prejudice and discriminate, but only the dominant group has the social, historical, and institutional power that backs prejudice and infuses it throughout our society. So as we're attending to sexism, racism, and ableism, these are things that are systemically and structurally embedded in the ways in which we engage, okay? So those terms are not used interchangeably as either, and they oftentimes are, okay? So as we're attending to racism and how that is embedded institutionally and structurally in the ways in which our schools function and the ways in which many of our institutions function across our country, we know that there is a social, historical, and institutional sense of power that is backing that, right? Very different from acting on a prejudgment on a person in a moment, right? And so those are two very different things that we also need to understand. This idea also reinforces the perspective that there is no such thing as reverse sexism or reverse racism, because the isms are connected to social, historical, and institutional power. Someone can be racist or say something that is racist. Someone can be sexist or say or do something that is sexist. But when we're attending to the idea of reverse racism and reverse sexism, those are misnomers, because for those entities or those isms to exist, there has to be a connection to power relations that are embedded and pervasive. And so in that particular moment, myself as that I identify as female, as woman, can say something that's sexist, but to say that I am a part of reverse sexism is a misnomer, because I don't have the necessary power systemically and structurally that typically has been given to men over time, right? As we're attending to what happens in certain exchanges, we're thinking about the dynamics of pay between men and women, some of the ways in which we see that show up in different places, right? There is a historical and embedded and pervasive connection to the power relations that exist. And we have to understand and differentiate between the two. And as I'm attending to power relations, I also want to make sure that we understand what I mean as we move through this course, because you might see connections to power relations in some of the language and some of the things that you might read. So we know that prejudice plus discrimination plus power is what equals oppression. That's how we see the relationship that exists between these two things. Oppression are policies, practices, traditions, norms, definitions, or even discourses that function to systematically exploit a particular social group to benefit over another group. This is connected to institutional control, ideological domination, and historical and cultural connections that we see. We know that oppression occurs when one group's prejudice is backed by the historical, social, and institutional power that I mentioned on the previous slide, okay? That's where we see oppression. So if there's a group that is privileged in a particular aspect, there is a group that is oppressed in that same aspect, right? They work simultaneously together. And oftentimes the group that is navigating the oppressed reality is experiencing it because oftentimes the group that is privileged has a connection to historical, social, and institutional power that has been able to maintain that form of privilege. Another term to understand as we're thinking about power and oppression is this notion of hegemony and power. And hegemony is really the systematic way of thinking about the ways in which there is a controlling way that we think about our existence in society, and a controlling way that we don't even realize, right? Hegemonic forces are invisible. We think we're making this decision. We think that we are controlling particular aspects of what is happening outside of ourselves, but we are not, because there are other forms of power that are at play, right? And in that hegemony or those hegemonic forces and power, oftentimes dominant groups are maintaining that power because there is some component of privilege that is being benefited or that is being sustained in that maintenance and in that lack of disruption of what is happening, right? And there is an imposing of a particular ideology that this is just the way things are on everyone that's in this space. So hegemony is like the way that we make sense of what is happening around us, right? And so we internalize dominance, we internalize oppression, and we become unaware of the ways in which these systems are very much actively acting on our behalf, and that we are acting in the system to reinforce these aspects that are connected to power and oppression. Might be very complex for those of you that are new, but I really would encourage you, if any of these words or terms are jumping out at you, to do a Google search, do some reading, or even reach out to your instructor to see if there's some support, some additional readings that you could glean from as you're attending to understanding this a little bit better. I want you to, on this page, or at this point in the presentation, to look at some examples. Oftentimes I talk about power and oppression, and I have several students that have tensions or have never thought about it before. So the tension is that I've never realized these things before, and it's unsettling to me to know that this is what is happening, right? Or I've experienced this and I didn't have a name for what was happening. But now that I am being able to place a name to an experience, I'm still unsettled because I didn't realize that all of this was at play, right? So I'd like to give some examples in this moment for you just to skim through some of the ways in which we make sense of dominant group ideologies and how it shows up, and some of the ways in which oppressed group identities might navigate and experience this notion of power and oppression, okay? Read through the list. Think about what stands out to you, remembering that both groups are in a social relationship and they're receiving these same messages, right? They're internalizing these messages because it's so much a part of who we are and how we exist, right? It's the hegemonic realities that exist outside of ourselves. We think we're making these decisions, but there are other things that are having implications that shape how we even come to certain ideas in the first place, right? And so even as a young child, you're receiving some of these messages and you're internalizing them. And then you're even taught, if you are representative of an oppressed group identity, oftentimes, to see the dominant group as being deserving and more suitable for these particular perspectives, right? You don't even, for some, question that there's differences, there's inequities, right? There's inequality that's happening, right? In this system, because we also in the system are internalizing these messages associated to how we show up and how we work through these components of self. And these realities around power and oppression are very much tied to how students are existing and connected to their racial and ethnic identities. So you have this presentation to be able to review this list a little bit longer, but take some time to see what stands out to you. And maybe hopefully you see some things that you didn't even really consider as you're moving forward and thinking about then how this then translates into the ways in which we understand ourselves and the ways in which we understand those that are different from ourselves. That might make it a little bit easier, maybe not, but hopefully so, to attend to in our better understanding of how oppression works, what privilege really is. Again, at this point, I often have students that have tensions around privilege because we have had some challenging times in our lived experiences, and we have navigated certain realities that we feel that we don't have privilege associated to certain aspects of who we are. But the reality is that most everyone has privilege in some aspect or another, right? And it's a term that oftentimes, again, people shy away from because they don't want to be seen as the person that has privilege in a particular thing. But the point at which we embrace and understand how privilege and oppression works, might we again be able to possibly disrupt and dismantle the ways in which we see and understand the privilege that we have in order to disrupt the ways in which those that are not privileged in a particular form of identity have to navigate their lived experiences. So a shared definition. Privilege refers to the rights, the advantages, the protections that are available based on structural advantages connected to that component of identity. Because dominant groups oftentimes occupy the positions of power that we talked about on the previous slides, oftentimes there are privileges, social and institutional advantages associated with that. There are privileges associated with the ways in which we identify, okay? Privilege is both visible and invisible. And these are visible and invisible in many different ways. They're invisible because they have internal and attitudinal effects for how we engage. This is oftentimes the thing that maintains, I feel like, the privilege the most, to the point to where people don't want to even engage with the notion or the concept of privilege. I can speak to my own lived experience as a professor at the University of Florida. I am very privileged in my educational achievements, right? I am privileged with the type of education that I've been able to achieve over time. When I go into certain spaces, people engage with me differently because of the privilege that I have when they determine or find out that I work at the University of Florida. I'm even privileged working at the University of Florida. When I mentioned that I work at the University of Florida, there's some privilege to the ways in which even some people, those of many of you are not in Gainesville, but for those of you that are in Gainesville, when you say you're at UF, there's some privilege that comes along with that, right? Or at least I have experienced that. I don't know if everyone has, but I have experienced that. But also beyond those exchanges, there's also privilege that is followed by internal and attitudinal effects of how we align with those aspects of privilege that we have. So oftentimes when we're talking about internal and attitudinal effects, it's a belief that we feel like we have the right to whatever privilege that we have, right? And that to that position and to that access that we have. It's the internalization of messages that your group might be superior, right? It's the lack of humility that emerges from your group identity around the fact that you might lack knowledge about a particular minoritized group. So if you're even thinking now that maybe you've been able to exist historically over time and not have ever had to engage in learning about a minoritized group's history, that is privilege. Because very much so, minoritized groups have to learn about the histories of the dominant group. Okay, you see that? You see that exchange? Or are you thinking about how you might see that show up? The invisibility that you don't have to even engage in that moment is your privilege. Okay? And the more that we might become in tune that that's not a bad thing, so much so as it's really just a thing that you need to be conscious of how it shows up. Because in that consciousness, we can start to unpack things like the good, bad binary, right? As we're tending to the way the racial tensions that are connected to race and ethnicity and how people show up. Because oftentimes we don't want to unpack privilege, we don't want to unpack power and oppression because we feel like we're good people. And there's tension around this idea of just being a good person because then we omit the opportunity to truly unpack who we are and how we show up. And so we limit the opportunity to see how complex this truly can be and the ways in which we really could try to disrupt some things that are happening because we feel like, oh, well, I'm not this because I'm a good person. I'm progressive, I'm educated, I'm open-minded, I'm well-intentioned, I'm young. That's not me. But there are still aspects of who we are where we're privileged, where we show up in spaces, where we lack knowledge about a particular person's reality, right? And we don't allow ourselves to realize that when we limit ourselves to just whether or not we're good or not, we limit the opportunity to grow and develop. The good bad binary, this is what I call it, it obscures the structural and systemic nature that racism lives in. And it makes it difficult for us to see the impact on a worldview of how our actions are connected, right? It blinds us because we feel like, well, I'm a good person, right? I'm a good person, so I don't have to deal with that. But the reality is we all need to be a part of the process. And although there are individual racist acts that do occur, oftentimes associated with the ways in which we're defining these bad people, ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, oftentimes associated with the older generation, right? Because it's historically maybe something they saw differently than what we see. And this is data that's pulled from the text, okay? So these are words that if you wanted to dig deeper, you could see some of the ways in which we see this good, bad binary show up. These individual acts are very much connected to a larger system of interlocking dynamics. And if we allow ourselves to limit and remain in the good, bad binary, then we don't look at the interlocking dynamics that are part of that larger system. Being good or being good or bad or however or nice, right, doesn't matter. Racism is embedded in our culture, and we limit ourselves when we don't allow ourselves to see how this might be at play, how this might be at play for us, how this might be at play for the communities and the spaces that we're in, and how this might be at play for the students that are in our schools and in our classrooms. And this leads us to anti-racism and why it's important. As we've talked about throughout this entire talk, the importance of understanding and developing a more heightened consciousness and awareness about what these terms mean and how this connects to an individual's realities around their race and ethnicity is this notion of anti-racism. And at this point, I'm assuming that maybe not everyone, but the majority of us might have at least heard the term anti-racism, but maybe we don't know where it comes from. And so I end our last couple of slides introducing us to anti-racism and what it means. And when I say anti-racism, I'm talking about the active process, right? So once you become aware, you become more conscious, you know, you've understood yourself, you understand the areas that you need to strengthen in regards to maybe historical connections or your history is connected to bias, prejudice, discrimination. You're making sense of some of the ways in which you might be privileged in certain aspects of self or not. You are tending to the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems and organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes so that power can be redistributed and shared equitably. Okay? So anti-racism is that you're actively involved in eliminating racism. So you're not just stuck at the good bad binary of I'm a good person, so that's it, right? Maybe you're saying I'm a good person and I'm going to fight against racism because I don't stand for that, right? Ibram Kendi would even suggest if you're not racist, you're either racist or anti-racist, right? You either are standing against racism or you're in a system that is perpetuating the racism, okay? There's a text called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, critical scholar from American University. Very popular book at the moment for those that might be interested. Anti-racism is the practice of identifying, challenging, and changing the values, structures, and behaviors that perpetuate systemic racism. Keywords: identifying, challenging, and changing. Anti-racism is an active way of seeing and being in the world in order to transform it. We know that racism is happening at all levels. It's systemically ingrained in our country. And so it doesn't happen exclusively in certain very siloed places, right? It doesn't happen only when we might see the way that the media might want to particularly focus on it for 1 week out of 52 weeks of the year, right? It happens all around us. And so anti-racism is being a part of actively being against seeing it take place in the spaces that we might have the more salient spheres of influence. Anti-racism in education. This is where a person practices anti-racism and works to be aware of how is racism affecting the lived experiences of people of culture and indigenous people. If you're a teacher in the classroom, support personnel, administrator, or even if you're in other spaces, this applies, right? How is racism systemic and how has it been a part of the foundational aspects of society throughout history? So having an understanding of what we get from the Joel Spring text to translating it to how it relates to what's happening right now, right? Do we see the connection between how those attitudes and behaviors can be manifested in both formal policies and practices within institutions that we are also a part of? Asking those necessary questions. Anti-racist education is based in the notion of race and racial discrimination as being embedded in policies and practices and the institutional structures. And it's a goal that we will aid students in understanding the nature and the characteristics of these barriers that are at place because they are there, and that we are actively a part of working to dismantle them. We're going to watch very briefly 6 Ways to Be an Anti-Racist Educator with Dina Simmons. And then I want you to take some time after you watch this just to think about what notes you can pull from this presentation and any questions that you might have.
There are many teachers already doing great work, and I just want to take the time to thank them and to big them up for the magic that they're creating in their classrooms. we can all get better at our practice and put in the anti-racist and equity lenses to our work to ensure that we do no harm. Good instruction should be student-centered, and student-centered is being culturally responsive and being anti-racist. And so for the teachers, one way to get better is really to start with self. Really check in with yourself. What are my biases? How are we being self-aware? So, if I'm a teacher or curriculum developer, let's check this for an anti-racist lens. Let's check this for a culturally responsive lens. Now let's do the research and ask people what they need and really be deliberate about that self-awareness so that we're not imposing our values. We have to be mindful of our power and not abusing it. Another thing that I would say is the collective work. Get together with your crew and learn together. And that learning can happen through book clubs. It could be looking at videos and going to talks or sitting through online Zoom conversations. There's so many ways that we can learn, but it doesn't just stop at reading or watching. It's talking about, now that we know, how will we do better? So coming up with a plan to do more with each other and to hold each other accountable. I also have people think about, what's their curricula look like? Is what I'm teaching representative of my students? Am I affirming my students in what I teach and how I teach? Am I affirming my students when I interact with them? So really asking those questions of self and of our practice so that we ensure that our students are safe. I would also push educators to really think about the larger context. Where are students coming from? What are their stories? How can I learn their stories? What's my plan to get to know the stories of my students, of their families? And I think we need to really start asking our students and our communities what they need. And too often we go up in communities, we go into our classrooms and we think we know what people need. If we don't ask them what they need, we're not giving them what they need. And so we constantly have to ask the people that we are in partnership with how we can do better and how to learn together.
Hopefully in that, you heard something that stood out to you as we reflect on everything that we have learned in our lecture on race and ethnicity. If you have any questions, please reach out to your instructor and enjoy your time as you work through our Module 2.